Velther stood in the cargo bay of the Federation cruiser Harmony's Edge, watching the strange new creatures prepare for battle. His forearms crossed over his chest as he studied them with growing confusion. These humans looked so weak. Their skin was soft and pink, with no natural armor like his own chitinous plates. They had only 2 arms each, and they were shorter than most Altany warriors. Yet command had assigned them to one of the most dangerous missions in the sector, the briefing. Room had been full of whispers when Captain Velther first heard about the human reinforcements. The Altany were proud warriors. They had been fighting across the galaxy for generations. Their thick shells could stop small arms fire, and their forearms made them deadly in close combat. Why would they need help from these soft-looking creatures? Now, as he watched them work, Velther tried to understand what made humans special. They moved around their equipment with careful attention, checking every piece multiple times. One of them, a female with short black hair, ran her hands over her weapon again and again. She seemed to be counting something under her breath. That's Sergeant Haijin, said Captain Dongwu, the human commander. He had approached Velther quietly, moving with surprising stealth for such a large species. She's our squad leader. Former Special Forces. Velther's translator worked quickly to convert the human words. Special Forces meant elite soldiers. But these humans didn't look elite, they looked nervous. The youngest one, a male called Jinho, kept fidgeting with his gear. His hands shook slightly as he loaded ammunition into his weapon. Your soldiers seem anxious, Velther said carefully. He didn't want to insult their new allies, but honesty was important before battle. Captain Dongwu smiled, showing his small white teeth. First time working with Altany forces. They're excited to learn from you. This confused Velther even more. Learn from them? The briefing had made it clear that humans were supposed to be some kind of special tactical asset. Yet here they were, acting like students instead of teachers. He watched as another human, a female called Subin, worked on some kind of electronic device. Her fingers moved quickly over the controls, and strange symbols appeared on the screen. She was small, even for a human, but she handled the complex equipment like it was simple. When she finished, she packed the device away and started working on medical supplies. Subin is our medic and engineer, Dongwu explained. She can fix almost anything, and she saved more lives than I can count. The largest human was called Taemin. He was checking a heavy weapon that Velther didn't recognize. It looked like standard Federation equipment, but something about it seemed different. The barrel was slightly wider, and there were extra components attached to the sides. When Taemin noticed Velther watching, he nodded politely and continued his work. What struck Velther most was how the humans interacted with each other. They shared their food without being asked. When Jinho dropped a piece of equipment, Haijin picked it up without comment. When Subin needed help carrying her medical supplies, Taemin was there immediately. They moved around each other like parts of a single organism. Altany warriors were individual fighters. They worked together when needed, but each warrior was responsible for himself. These humans seemed to think of themselves as one unit with 5 parts. Tell me about the mission, Velther said to Captain Dongwu. He had read the briefing, but he wanted to hear the human perspective. Dongwu's expression became serious. The Kronith Horde has taken the mining colony on Zarian 7. They're holding civilian hostages and using the facility as a forward base. Intelligence says there are at least 200 Kronith warriors, maybe more. Velther knew about the Kronith. They were brutal raiders who showed no mercy to prisoners. They enjoyed causing pain and often tortured captives for entertainment. The thought of civilians in their hands made his chitinous plates tighten with anger. Standard assault pattern? Velther asked. We'll see when we get there, Dongwu replied. Every situation is different, this answer bothered Velther. Altany battle doctrine was clear and proven. You identified the enemy, you attacked with superior force, you won. These humans seemed to think tactics were something you made up as you went along. As the ship approached the drop zone, the humans began their final preparations. Velther watched them closely, trying to understand their methods. They checked Their weapons one last time, but they also did strange things. Jinho pulled out a small photograph and looked at it for several seconds. Haijin touched a small metal object hanging around her neck. Subin wrote something in a small book and then put it away carefully. What are they doing? Velthor asked. Remembering why we fight, Dongwu said simply. The drop alarm sounded throughout the ship. Velthor felt the familiar tension in his stomach as the ship began its descent toward the planet's surface. This was always the worst part of any mission. The waiting and wondering what they would find below. The humans strapped themselves into their drop seats with efficient movements. Their earlier nervousness seemed to disappear as the mission became real. Jinho's hands stopped shaking. Haijin's face became calm and focused. Subin closed her eyes and took deep, steady breaths. Taemin sat perfectly still, like a statue. As the ship shook from atmospheric entry, Velthor found himself studying these strange allies more carefully. Maybe they were different from what he expected. Maybe their soft appearance hid something else underneath. But what? The cargo bay filled with the sound of wind and engines as they approached the landing zone. Through the small windows, Velthor could see the planet's surface growing larger. Zarian 7 was a desert world with scattered mining installations. The main colony was visible in the distance, a collection of white buildings surrounded by defensive walls. Those walls were now controlled by the Kronith. 30 seconds to drop, announced the ship's pilot. The humans stood up and checked their equipment one final time. Captain Dongwu looked at Velthor and nodded. Ready to show us how real warriors fight? Velthor straightened his armor and activated his weapon systems. His forearms moved independently as he prepared for battle. Ready? The cargo bay doors opened with a loud mechanical sound. Wind rushed in, carrying the smell of desert sand and something else, smoke from the colony. The humans moved toward the exit in perfect formation, their steps synchronized like a drill team. As they prepared to drop toward the planet's surface. Velthor wondered what the next few hours would bring. Would these soft-looking humans prove themselves in battle? Or would he and his Altany warriors end up protecting them from the brutal Kronith? The drop light turned green. Without hesitation, the humans jumped from the ship and fell toward the planet below. Velthor and his squad followed, their heavy forms cutting through the thin atmosphere. The battle for Zarian 7 was about to begin, and Velthor was about to learn something about humans that would change everything he thought he knew. The landing was harder than Velthor expected. His heavy Altany body hit the desert sand with a loud thump, sending up clouds of dust. Around him, his squad members landed with similar crashes, their chitinous armor protecting them from the impact. But when he looked for the humans, he was surprised to see they had landed silently, rolling to absorb the shock and immediately taking cover behind nearby rocks. Within seconds, the humans had spread out in a defensive pattern. They moved so quietly that Velthor had to use his enhanced hearing to track their positions. This was very different from Altany landing procedures, which focused on quick regrouping and immediate advance toward the enemy. Captain Dongwu appeared beside a large boulder, speaking into a small communication device. His voice was barely above a whisper, but somehow his team could hear him clearly. They responded with hand signals instead of words, which confused Velthor. Why hide their communications when they were still several kilometers from the enemy? Through his scope, Velthor studied the mining colony in the distance. The Kronith had built additional defensive positions around the walls. He could see their crude watchtowers and weapon emplacements. Standard Altany tactics would call for a direct assault on the weakest section of wall, using superior firepower to breach the defenses. We advance in formation, Velthor announced to the combined force. Heavy weapons target the main gate. Infantry follows behind armor support. Captain Dongwu held up his hand. Wait, we need to scout first. Scout? Velthor as translator struggled with the concept. The enemy position is clear. We attack with overwhelming force. Look closer, Haijin said quietly. She had appeared next to them without making a sound. Third tower from the left. See the movement? Velthor enhanced his vision and focused on the tower. At first he saw nothing unusual, just Kronith guards. Then he noticed something that made his stomach turn cold. There were smaller figures mixed in with the guards, figures that moved wrong, like they were tied up. Hostages, Subin confirmed, studying the scene through her own scope. They're using civilians as shields. This changed everything. Altany weapons were designed to punch through heavy armor and destroy fortified positions. They couldn't risk hitting innocent people. Velther felt frustrated anger building in his chest. The Cronoth were cowards who hid behind the weak. New plan, Captain Dongwu said calmly. We need intelligence on guard rotations, defensive positions, and hostage locations before we move. That will take hours, Velther protested. Every minute we wait, those people suffer. And if we attack blind, they die? Dongwu replied. His voice was steady, but Velther could see something hard in the human's eyes. We do this right. What followed was the most complicated military operation Velther had ever witnessed. The humans didn't just charge forward like proper warriors. Instead, they began a careful dance of positioning and information gathering that seemed to involve every piece of equipment they carried. Su-Bin set up her electronic device and began intercepting Cronoth communications. She worked for 20 minutes, her fingers dancing over controls, before announcing she had broken their encryption. Now they could listen to enemy radio traffic and even send false messages. Meanwhile, Haijin simply disappeared. One moment she was crouched behind a rock next to Velther, the next she was gone. He looked around in confusion until Dongwu pointed to a distant ridge. There was Haijin, somehow having covered half a kilometer without being seen by guards or thermal sensors. How did she do that? Velther asked. Practice, Dongwu said with what might have been pride. Jinho, the nervous young human, turned out to be an excellent marksman. From their concealed position, he began taking careful shots at Cronoth equipment. Not at the guards themselves, that would alert them, but at communication arrays, sensor dishes, and power cables. Each shot was perfectly placed to look like equipment failure rather than sabotage. Tae-Min was doing something even stranger. He had taken apart his heavy weapon and was rebuilding it using parts from the mining equipment scattered around the drop zone. When Velther asked what he was doing, Tae-Min just smiled and said he was improving efficiency. After 2 hours of this careful preparation, Velther was getting impatient. His warriors were ready for battle, but the humans kept finding new things to analyze and adjust. This wasn't how wars were supposed to be fought. Where was the honor in hiding and sneaking? Then Subin announced something that changed his mind. I've got their patrol schedules and guard rotations. Also intercepted a message about prisoner locations. The good news is most hostages are being held in the central building. Bad news is they're planning to move them tomorrow. Move them where? Dongwu asked. Doesn't say. But the message mentioned final preparations and examples. For the galaxy, Velther felt his chitinous plates shift with anger. The Cronoth were planning something terrible for those innocent people. Every Altany warrior knew the stories of what happened to prisoners when the Cronoth were finished with them. Now, do we attack? He asked. Captain Dongwu studied the colony through his scope for a long moment. Haijin report. The female human's voice came through their communications, clear despite being transmitted from inside the enemy perimeter. I count 47 guards on the walls, rotating every 4 hours. Heavy weapons at the main gate and 2 side positions. Most of the Cronoth are in the barracks buildings on the east side. How many hostages? At least 60 in the central building, families, mostly I can see children. Something in Haijin's voice made Velther look at the other humans more carefully. Their earlier calm professionalism was still there, but underneath it he sensed something else. Anger, maybe, or something colder. Can you get us inside without triggering alarms? Dongwu asked. Give me 2 hours to study their patterns. There's a maintenance tunnel that leads under the east wall. Guards don't check it because it's too small for Cronoth, but humans could fit. Velther was amazed. In less than half a day, these humans had gathered more intelligence than most military units could collect in a week. They knew guard positions, patrol routes, prisoner locations. and had found a secret way inside, all without firing a single shot or alerting the enemy. "What about us?" Valther asked. "Altany are too large for maintenance tunnels. You'll be our distraction," Dongwu explained. "When we're in position to secure the hostages, you attack the main gate. Draw their attention while we get the civilians out." This bothered Valther. It sounded like the humans were doing the important work while his warriors just made noise. "Altany don't run from fights." "We're not asking you to run," Subin said. Gently, "we're asking you to be the hammer while we're the scalpel." As the day continued, Valther watched the humans work with growing respect. They weren't cowards or weaklings. They were something else entirely: precise, patient, and completely focused on saving innocent lives rather than winning glory in battle. When evening came, the humans made their final preparations. They checked their equipment again, but this time it felt different, more serious. Jinho's hands were steady now, and his nervous energy had transformed into quiet focus. Subin packed her medical supplies with extra care, as if she expected to need them. Taemin finished modifying his weapon and tested it briefly. The sound it made was unlike anything Valther had heard before. "Ready?" Captain Dongwu asked his team. They nodded silently. No words were needed, as darkness fell over Zarian 7. Valther realized he was about to see these strange humans in action for the first time. Part of him was curious about their methods. Another part was worried they might not be strong enough for what was coming, but deep in his mind, a small voice wondered if maybe he should be worried about something else entirely. The message that changed everything came just before dawn. Subin was monitoring Cronoth communications when her face went pale. She listened to her equipment for several long minutes, then called Captain Dongwu over with an urgent hand signal. "What is it?" Dongwu asked quietly. Subin's voice was tight with controlled anger. "They're not just holding hostages. They're conducting experiments." Valther felt his chitinous plates tighten. "What kind of experiments?" "The kind that violate every treaty in the galaxy," Subin replied. She played back a recorded transmission through her translator. The Cronoth voices were rough and cruel, discussing their captives like they were laboratory animals. The transmission spoke of testing pain tolerance in different species. It mentioned separating families to study emotional responses. Worst of all, it discussed using children to manipulate their parents' behavior during torture sessions. Valther had fought many battles against many enemies, but this made him feel sick. Even in war, there were rules. Even the most violent species usually left civilians alone. But the Cronoth were treating innocent people like toys to break. "We need to move now," he said, checking his weapons. "Wait," Captain Dongwu said. But his voice sounded different than before, colder. "Subin, can you get visual confirmation?" Subin worked at her equipment for several minutes, tapping into the colony's security cameras. When images appeared on her screen, Valther wished he hadn't looked. The Cronoth had turned the central building into a chamber of horrors. Families were kept in small cages. Some of the prisoners showed signs of recent torture, but it was the children that made Valther's hands shake with rage. They were so small, so frightened. Some were crying silently, trying not to make noise. Others just stared at nothing, their minds already broken by what they had seen when Valther looked at the humans. He saw something that made his prey instincts activate for the first time in years. Their faces had gone completely blank. Not calm blank. Like someone had turned off all emotion and left only cold intelligence behind. Captain Dongwu spoke into his communication device, but not to his team. He was calling their ship in orbit. "Command, this is Ground Team Alpha, requesting immediate priority communication with Fleet Command." "Negative, Ground Team, standard communication protocols only." "Override code Omega 77, Dongwu said quietly. There was a long pause. Then a different voice came on the channel. "Ground Team Alpha, you have Fleet Command." "Go ahead." "Sir, we have confirmation of Category 5 war crimes against civilian populations. Requesting permission to implement Protocol 7. Another pause. Velthor didn't understand what Protocol 7 meant, but something about the way Dongwu said it made his stomach feel cold. Permission granted, Captain. All restrictions lifted. Repeat, all restrictions are lifted. Understood, Command. Alpha Team out. Captain Dongwu turned to his squad. They were all watching him with expressions Velthor couldn't read. Then Dongwu spoke in a language that wasn't in any Federation database. The words sounded harsh and clipped like a combat code. The other humans responded in the same language. Their voices were calm, but something about their posture had changed. They moved differently now, like predators who had just caught the scent of prey. What's happening? Velthor asked. Hyjin looked at him with eyes that seemed to see right through him. We're going to get those people out. That's what we planned. To do anyway. No, she said softly. That was the plan when we thought this was a standard hostage situation. This is something else. Subin began modifying her equipment again, but now she was working with frightening speed. Her fingers moved over the controls like she was playing a musical instrument. Within minutes, she had transformed her intelligence-gathering device into something that looked more like a weapon. Jinho was no longer the nervous young soldier Velthor had met on the ship. He moved with deadly precision as he prepared his weapons, checking sights and ammunition with the focus of a master craftsman. When he finished, he looked at Velthor and spoke in perfect Altani battle language. With respect, warrior, you may want to keep your people back during the assault. Velthor was shocked. None of the humans had spoken Altani before. Where did you learn our tongue? We learn many things, Jinho replied. Then he switched back to human speech and returned to his preparations. Taemin's modified weapon now looked nothing like Federation standard equipment. It was larger, heavier, and covered with additional components that Velthor didn't recognize. When Taemin tested it briefly, the sound was like thunder. The weapon's energy discharge left scorch marks on rocks 50 meters away. Is that legal? Velthor asked. Not in Federation space, Taemin admitted. But we're not in Federation space anymore. Captain Dongwu gathered his team for final planning. But instead of the careful, methodical approach they had used before, this briefing was different. Dongwu spoke quickly and efficiently, using terms and concepts that Velthor's translator couldn't process. The humans nodded at each instruction, their faces showing complete understanding. What about the distraction attack? Velthor asked. Do you still need us to assault the main gate? Dongwu considered this. That won't be necessary anymore. Then what do we do? Stay here and secure the evacuation route. When we bring the hostages out, they'll need medical attention and protection. Velthor felt insulted. My warriors didn't come here to play guard duty. We came to fight. Hyjin knelt beside him, bringing her face close to his. When she spoke, her voice was gentle, but her eyes were like black ice. Captain Velthor, I need you to understand something. What we're about to do, it's not fighting. It's something else. And if you see it, you might not be able to forget it. What are you talking about? Humans have rules about war, she explained patiently. We follow the Federation treaties. We protect civilians, we try to minimize casualties, we use appropriate force. She paused and looked toward the colony. But when someone tortures children for fun, those rules change. Subin looked up from her equipment. All communications are jammed. The Kronoth can't call for help or coordinate their defenses. Perimeter sensors are down, Jinho reported. I can disable their motion detectors and thermal imaging. Structural analysis complete, Taemin announced. I know exactly where to hit their buildings to create maximum psychological impact with minimum risk to hostages. Captain Dongwu stood up and checked his weapon one final time. Questions? His team shook their heads silently. Time to work. They moved toward the colony like ghosts. Velthor watched them disappear into the darkness and realized he couldn't track their movements anymore. They had become invisible, even to his enhanced senses. Then the screaming started. It began with the Kronoth guards on the outer perimeter. One moment they were at their posts, the next moment they were gone. No weapons fire, no explosions, just silence where living beings had been moments before. The guards in the towers began shouting in panic, trying to report attacks they couldn't see. But their communications were dead, and their backup systems had been disabled. They were isolated and alone in the dark. Velthor heard a sound that made his blood run cold, Cronoth voices calling out in fear. These were warriors who laughed at death and tortured prisoners for entertainment. But now they sounded terrified. What are the humans doing? One of his Altani warriors asked. Velthor didn't answer because he didn't know. Whatever was happening in that colony, it was beyond his understanding of warfare. The humans weren't just attacking the enemy, they were systematically dismantling them. 20 minutes after the assault began, Captain Dongwu's voice came over the communication channel. Hostages secured. Beginning evacuation. Prepare medical facilities. What about the Cronoth? Velthor asked. There was a pause. Then Dongwu replied in a voice completely empty of emotion. What Cronoth? The first group of hostages emerged from the colony just as the sun reached the horizon. They moved slowly, supported by the humans who had rescued them. Velthor had prepared himself to see injured people, but the reality was worse than he had. Imagine some of the prisoners could barely walk. Others stared at nothing, their minds damaged by what they had experienced. The children were the worst. They flinched at every sound and clung desperately to any adult who showed them kindness. Su Bin worked quickly to treat their injuries, her medical supplies seeming endless as she moved from person to person. Her hands were gentle as she bandaged wounds and administered pain medication, but Velthor noticed that her eyes never lost the cold focus they had gained during the mission briefing. How many? Velthor asked Captain Dongwu as more survivors appeared. 63 still alive, Dongwu replied. His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it that made Velthor's translator work harder than usual. We were too late for the others. Velthor didn't ask how many others. He could see the answer in the humans' faces. As the evacuation continued, Velthor found himself studying the colony in the distance. From the outside it looked almost normal. The walls were intact, the buildings undamaged. There was no sign of the massive battle he had expected to see. No explosions, no burning structures, no visible damage at all. What did you do in there? He asked Junho, who was helping an elderly colonist walk. Junho's face was as blank as stone. We completed our mission. That wasn't an answer, but something in the young human's tone warned Velthor not to push for details. Instead, he watched as Haijin appeared at the colony's main gate, moving with her impossible stealth. She was carrying a small child who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. The child was crying silently, the way children cry when they've learned that making noise brings pain. Haijin held her carefully, whispering soft words in what sounded like a human lullaby. But when she looked up and met Velthor's eyes, her expression was like looking into the heart of a dying star. The little one was in the worst section, she said quietly. They used her to make her parents cooperate during questioning. Velthor felt his chitinous plates shift with rage, but he also felt something else, a growing understanding of why the humans had changed so completely. These weren't just random victims of war. They were people who had been deliberately tortured by creatures, who enjoyed causing pain. Tae-Min was the last to leave the colony. He walked calmly through the main gate, his modified weapon slung over his shoulder. To anyone watching, he looked like a soldier completing a routine mission. But Velthor noticed that none of the Cronoth guards were visible anywhere. Where are the enemy forces? Velthor asked. Neutralized, Tae-Min replied simply. Oh. Of them, there were over 200 warriors in there? Tae-Min looked at him with eyes that held no emotion at all. Yes, all of them. Something about the way he said it made Velthor realize he didn't want to know the details. In all his years of warfare, he had never seen an enemy force simply disappear without a trace. Battles left evidence. Bodies, wreckage, signs of struggle. But the colony looked untouched, except for the absence of its captors. As they prepared to transport the survivors to safety, one of the rescued colonists approached Captain Dongwu. She was a middle-aged woman with bandages on her arms and haunted eyes. Thank you, she whispered. They said no one was coming. They said everyone had forgotten about us. Dongwu knelt down so he could look her in the eyes. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, completely different from the cold efficiency he had shown during the mission. We never forget, and we never leave anyone behind. The woman began to cry, not from pain this time, but from relief. Dongwu held her shoulders steady until she could breathe normally again. Then he helped her toward the evacuation area where Subin was preparing more medical treatment. But as the captain turned away, Velther saw something in his expression that made every instinct he possessed scream danger. For just a moment, the mask of professional calm slipped, and Velther glimpsed something underneath that was absolutely terrifying. Humans, he realized, were not the gentle creatures they appeared to be. They were something else entirely, something that could show infinite compassion to the innocent and unlimited brutality to those who harmed them. During the flight back to Federation space, Velther tried to piece together what had happened in the colony. He reviewed sensor data, communication logs, and tactical recordings, but none of it made sense. According to the official record, the human team had entered the facility, secured the hostages, and eliminated enemy resistance. Mission accomplished, but the details were wrong. There was no record of weapons fired during the assault. No explosions, no energy discharges, no signs of combat at all. The humans had somehow neutralized over 200 heavily armed Kronith warriors without leaving any evidence of how they had done it. When he asked Subin about this during the medical debriefing, she looked at him with tired eyes. Sometimes. The best way to win a fight is to make sure your enemy can't fight back. That doesn't explain what happened to them, doesn't it? She asked quietly. Then she returned to treating the survivors. Ending the conversation, Velther found Jinho cleaning his weapon in the ship's armory. The young human worked with methodical precision, checking every component with the care of someone who trusted. His life to his equipment. You spoke perfect Altani during the mission, Velther said. Where did you learn our language? Jinho paused in his cleaning. We study the cultures we work with. It shows respect. You've worked with Altani before? We've worked with many species, Jinho replied. Humans adapt quickly. That phrase, humans adapt quickly, stuck in Velther's mind. It suggested that these 5 individuals weren't unique among their species. They were examples of what humans could become when circumstances required it. Later, he found Haijin in the ship's observation deck, staring out at the stars. She seemed smaller now, more like the other humans he had met in peaceful contexts. But he couldn't forget the predator he had glimpsed during the mission. Can I ask you something? He said carefully. She nodded without looking away from the viewport. What? You did in there? Is that normal for humans? Haijin was quiet for a long time. Then she said, humans have a saying. We are capable of great kindness and terrible cruelty. Often in the same day. Today was one of those days. I've never seen anything like it. Most species haven't, she agreed. We try to keep it that way. Why? She finally turned to look at him, and he saw sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Because once people see what we can do when we're truly angry, they never look at us the same way again. As their ship continued toward Federation space, Velther sat in his quarters and tried to process what he had learned. The humans were not the weak allies he had expected. They were not even the clever tacticians he had come to respect. They were something far more dangerous, a species capable of unlimited compassion and unlimited violence, depending on the circumstances. They could show infinite patience with the innocent and absolute ruthlessness with those who threatened them. The thought that kept returning to his mind was simple and terrifying. What would happen if humans ever decided that the Federation itself was a threat? 3 days after returning to Federation space, Velther sat in his quarters aboard the military station, staring at the mission report on his screen. The official version was clean and simple. Joint Federation Human Task Force successfully liberated civilian hostages from Kronith raiders. Enemy forces neutralized. 0 friendly casualties. Mission accomplished, but the numbers bothered him. Over 200 Kronith warriors had simply vanished. No bodies recovered, no wreckage found. No evidence of what had happened to them except that they were no longer there. The report listed them as eliminated by a human tactical team, but provided no details about methods or weapons used. He had tried to access more detailed files, but his security clearance wasn't high enough. This frustrated him because he was a senior officer with years of combat experience. What could be so classified that even veteran warriors couldn't see it? The humans had returned to their normal behavior almost immediately after the mission. Captain Dongwu filed his reports with professional efficiency. Subin returned to her medical duties, treating injured Federation personnel with the same gentle care she had shown the rescued colonists. Jinho went back to seeming young and slightly nervous. Though Velther now knew that appearance was misleading, Haijin had been assigned to train Federation Special Forces in advanced reconnaissance techniques. The few soldiers who attended her classes came back quiet and thoughtful, but they wouldn't talk about what they had learned. Taemin had disappeared entirely. When Velther asked about him, Captain Dongwu simply said he had been reassigned to other duties. No one seemed to know where he had gone or what those duties might be. The rescued colonists were recovering in the stations, medical facilities. Most of them were responding well to treatment, though the psychological damage would take much longer to heal. The children were slowly learning to trust again, helped by human counselors who seemed to understand trauma in ways that other species didn't. Velther had visited the medical bay several times, partially to check on the survivors, but mostly to observe the humans working with them. He was amazed by their patience and skill in dealing with damaged minds. They could spend hours with a single frightened child, using techniques that gradually brought them back to the world of the living. But sometimes he caught glimpses of that other side, the cold efficiency he had seen during the mission. When one of the rescued colonists mentioned that some of his family members had been taken to the special room by the Kronith, the human counselor's expression had gone completely blank for just a moment before returning to professional compassion. On the fourth day, Velther received a message that his security clearance had been upgraded. Suddenly, he had access to files that had been hidden from him before. His first thought was excitement. Finally, he would learn what had really happened in that colony. His second thought, after reading the files, was terror. The human military records were unlike anything in the Federation database. They contained detailed analyses of every species humans had encountered, including psychological profiles, cultural weaknesses, and tactical assessments. The file on Altany warriors was comprehensive and eerily accurate, describing their combat methods, honor codes, and behavioral patterns with scientific precision, but it was the operational records that made Velther's hands shake. Humans had been involved in conflicts across the galaxy for years, often in situations where other species had failed completely. They specialized in what they called impossible rescues and precision elimination of hostile forces. The mission reports read like something from a nightmare. Entire pirate fleets had simply stopped existing after encountering human advisors. Slave trading operations had been shut down so thoroughly that no one could find evidence they had ever existed. Terrorist organizations had been infiltrated and neutralized from within, their members vanishing without a trace, and in every case, the human forces involved had shown the same pattern Velther had witnessed: infinite patience in planning, overwhelming precision in execution, and complete elimination of threats to innocent life. One file contained a psychological evaluation of human combat behavior that made Velther understand why his security clearance had been restricted. The report concluded that humans were persistence predators, a species that had evolved to hunt prey by following them relentlessly until exhaustion made them easy to kill, but unlike other predators, humans had developed pack intelligence that allowed them to coordinate complex strategies over long periods. They could plan for months or years, gathering information and positioning resources until they could strike with absolute certainty of success. The report's final conclusion was chilling. Human military forces should be considered allies at all costs. Under no circumstances should any Federation species initiate hostile action against human interests. Their response capabilities exceed all known parameters for acceptable military action. As Velther read through more files, he began to understand what he had really witnessed on Zarian 7. The humans hadn't just rescued hostages and eliminated guards. They had systematically erased every trace of Kronith presence on that world, ensuring that no one could ever use the same tactics again. The 5 individuals he had worked with weren't unusual examples of human capability. They were standard operators, trained to handle exactly the kind of situation they had encountered. Somewhere in human space, there were thousands more just like them, waiting for the next mission that required their special skills. The most disturbing file was labeled Human Emotional Response Patterns. It described how humans formed deep emotional bonds with their allies and showed extreme protective behavior toward anyone they considered part of their pack. But it also documented what happened when those protective instincts were triggered by threats to innocent life. The report used clinical language to describe what Velther had seen with his own eyes. Humans were capable of switching between compassionate protectors and efficient killers based on the behavior of their enemies. They could show infinite mercy to those who surrendered or proved harmless, and unlimited brutality to those who chose to harm the defenseless. They don't fight for territory or resources, the report concluded. They fight for the right of peaceful beings to exist without fear. This makes them simultaneously the best possible allies and the most dangerous possible enemies. On the 7th day after the mission, Velther was approached by Captain Dong-Wu in the station's recreation area. The human seemed relaxed and friendly, sharing a meal with several Federation officers who clearly enjoyed his company. "Mind if I sit down?" Dong-Wu asked politely. Velther gestured to an empty chair. "Of course." They ate in comfortable silence for several minutes before Dong-Wu spoke again. "I heard you've been reading some interesting files lately." Velther's translator worked overtime on the subtle implications in that statement. "My security clearance was upgraded." "Yes, it was. We requested that. Why?" Dong-Wu finished his meal before answering. "Because you fought alongside us. Because you saw us at work. And because you asked the right questions afterward." "What questions?" "You wanted to know what we were, not just what we did. Most species focus on our methods. You tried to understand our reasons." Velther considered this. "And what are your reasons?" "Simple," Dong-Wu replied. "We believe that every thinking being has the right to live without fear. When someone threatens that right, we remove the threat. Completely, when necessary." Dong-Wu's tone was casual, but his eyes held that familiar cold focus. The Kronith chose to torture children for entertainment. They forfeited their right to exist in civilized space. Velther realized he was looking at the core of human nature, not the gentle diplomats who served in Federation councils, but the steel underneath that made diplomacy possible. Humans could afford to be patient and kind because they were confident in their ability to deal with anyone who mistook kindness for weakness. "What happens now?" Velther asked. "Now you go back to your duties with a better understanding of who your allies really are," Dong-Wu said simply. "And hopefully you help other Federation species understand that humans are exactly the kind of friends they want to have." As Captain Dong-Wu left the recreation area, Velther sat alone with his thoughts. He understood now why humans had been so eager to join the Federation and why the Federation had been so quick to accept them. It wasn't because humans needed protection, it was because everyone else needed humans to be on their side. Later that day, Velther began writing his personal log entry about the mission. The official report would focus on tactics and results, but his private thoughts were about something more important. "Personal note," he dictated to his recording device. "Recommend immediate expansion of joint training programs with human forces. Other Federation species should see them in action, not to learn their specific methods, but to understand their commitment to protecting innocent life." He paused and looked out at the stars visible through his quarters viewport. Somewhere out there, other threats to peace were planning their next attacks on helpless civilians. But now those threats would have to face not just Federation military forces, but human advisors who took personal responsibility for the safety of anyone under their protection.